Tunisia, Northern Africa. Date, May 1943. Atmosphere, dust-choked, oppressive heat, the smell of diesel and decay. The camera pans across a landscape of scorched earth. In a shallow trench, a group of Italian soldiers from the Centauro division huddle together. Their uniforms are rags. Their ribs are visible through sweat-stained tunics. For weeks, their rations have been nothing more than a handful of hardtack and the bitter hope of a supply ship that never made it past the Royal Navy. They have been told by their officers that the Americans are a soft, decadent people, currently starving because German U-boats have cut off their lifelines. Suddenly, the roar of an M4 Sherman echoes through the wadi. The Italians raise their hands, eyes shut, waiting for the end. But the end doesn't come. Instead, a young American corporal jumps down, not with a bayonet, but with a strangely colorful cardboard tub. He pries off the lid, and the Italians recoil. They expect a weapon, a trap, or perhaps just more dust. What they see is white, frozen, and sweet. As the first Italian sergeant takes a spoonful of vanilla ice cream, his eyes widen in genuine terror. He looks at his men and realizes the war is over. Not because they were outfought, but because their enemy had so much resources. They brought a frozen dessert to a desert wasteland. By the early 1940s, the Mediterranean was not just a theater of shifting sands and naval maneuvers. It was a theater of biological attrition. For Benito Mussolini's Regio Esercito, the war had begun with a grand vision of a new Roman Empire. But by 1941, that vision was crumbling under the weight of a catastrophic logistical failure. The Italian soldier, often brave and technically proficient, was being systematically starved by his own high command. In the corridors of Rome, the fascist leadership spoke of autarky, national self-sufficiency. In reality, Italy lacked the coal, the steel, and most importantly, the caloric surplus to sustain a multi-front war. As the conflict dragged on, the average Italian infantryman's daily ration began to dwindle. While the official manuals promised meat, pasta, and wine, the reality on the front lines in North Africa and Sicily was a grim repetition of galletta, a hard, tooth-breaking biscuit, and tinned meat so poor in quality that the soldiers nicknamed it Asino Vecchio, Old Donkey. Water was even scarcer. In the blistering heat of the Tunisian desert or the rugged hills of Sicily, Italian units were often restricted to less than a liter of brackish, oily water per day. Their German allies in the Africa Corps fared only slightly better, but they at least had the benefit of a more robust supply chain from the continent. For the Italians, every day was a struggle against the heat and the hollow ache in their stomachs. Their propaganda told them that the plutocratic democracies, Britain and America, were crumbling. They were told that the Atlantic was a graveyard for Allied shipping, and that the citizens of London and New York were queuing for scraps of bread. This was a calculated lie, designed to keep the men in the trenches. The Italian soldier was led to believe that his suffering was shared by his enemy. They were told that the Americans were a mongrel race of soft city dwellers who couldn't endure the hardships of real combat. But as the tide turned at El Alamein and the Allies began their inexorable push toward Tunisia, the Italian perspective began to shift. They weren't just seeing more tanks and more planes. They were seeing a different kind of war. They were seeing a war of abundance. When an Italian patrol would occasionally overrun a small Allied forward post, they didn't find the starvation they were promised. They found white bread so soft it felt like cake. They found cigarettes made of fine Virginia tobacco. And they found rations, stews of beef and vegetables that contained more protein in one tin than an Italian squad might see in a week. The psychological foundation of the Axis began to crack, not under pressure of bullets, but under the weight of the realization that they had been lied to about the very nature of their enemy's strength. While the Italian soldier withered under the sun, a logistical miracle was being engineered across the Atlantic. In 1942 and 1943, the United States was not just mobilizing an army, it was mobilizing an industrial philosophy. To the American High Command, the GI was an industrial unit that required high-octane fuel to function. That fuel was calories, comfort, and morale. This led to the birth of a United States Army Quartermaster Corps on a scale the world had never seen. The statistics of this buildup are staggering. While Italy struggled to produce a few thousand trucks, American factories like Ford and Chrysler were churning out a vehicle every few minutes. By the time the Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, the Liberty ship program had hit its stride. These 14,000-ton behemoths were being launched faster than U-boats could sink them. Each ship was a floating warehouse, carrying everything from locomotive engines to millions of individual packets of chewing gum. But it wasn't just a quantity. It was the psychological intent behind the supplies. The U.S. government spent over $225 million in 1940s currency on the subsistence of its troops. They developed a K-ration, a 3-meal-a-day pack that included not just meat and biscuits, but chocolate bars, fruit bars, toilet paper, and matches. For the Italian soldiers watching from across the lines, the American supply dumps looked like mythical cities. They saw mountains of wooden crates, miles of fuel pipelines, and, most shockingly, refrigerated trucks. The concept of refrigerated logistics was perhaps the ultimate sign of American dominance. While the Axis struggled to keep their ammunition dry, the Americans were concerned with keeping their butter cold and their vegetables fresh. This led to the creation of the barge, ice cream, floating, a fleet of concrete and steel vessels whose sole purpose was to manufacture thousands of gallons of ice cream for troops in Pacific and Mediterranean. It was a $1 million investment per vessel, a sum that could have built several bombers or tanks. To the Germans and Italians, this was a baffling, almost offensive display of wealth. It signaled that America was so powerful, it could afford to dedicate massive military resources to a desert. This logistical disparity created a gravity of abundance. As the Americans pushed into Sicily during Operation Husky, they didn't just bring guns, they brought a lifestyle. The Italian military hierarchy, already fractured by internal dissent and the failure of Mussolini's promises, realized they weren't just fighting a military. They were fighting a civilization that had already won the war of production. The Italian POWs who would soon be captured were about to step out of a world of scarcity and into a world of shocking luxury that would change their perception of the war forever. To understand the Italian reaction to American dominance, one must first look at the tactical angle of nutrition. In the 1940s, Italy was still a largely agrarian society where meat was a luxury and white bread was reserved for wealthy or for feast days. The average Italian soldier's diet consisted of pane nero, a dark, dense, and often moldy rye bread and watery vegetable soups. When these men were captured and processed into American holding pens, the first thing they were handed was an interrogation form, a tray of food. The human angle of this encounter was one of profound psychological trauma disguised as kindness. Italian prisoners, expecting the brutal treatment promised by fascist propaganda, were instead confronted with a mess kit miracle. Veterans' memoirs recall the specific shock of American white bread. To a soldier who had spent years eating grit-filled biscuits in the Libyan desert, the bleached, soft, and slightly sweet American loaf felt like a high-end pastry. There are documented accounts of Italian POWs in the first weeks of captivity hiding slices of bread under their shirts, unable to believe that such a resource was unlimited. They assumed the Americans were playing a trick, that this was a last meal before execution. Then there was the sugar angle. The United States was the only nation in the war that treated candy as a strategic necessity. Every American ration contained high-calorie sugar in the form of Hershey's tropical bars, or Charms candies. For an Italian soldier whose blood sugar had been dangerously low for months, the sudden intake of glucose provided a physical high that made the American captor seem less like an enemy and more like a provider. This was the most effective form of psychological warfare ever devised. The Americans didn't have to break the Italians with a fight with torture. They simply dissolved it with chocolate and cigarettes. The realization was immediate. How could Italy ever defeat a nation that fed its prisoners better than Italy fed its generals? The most potent symbol of American dominance was not a secret code or a heavy bomber, but the technological angle of the ice cream barge. In 1945, the U.S. Navy spent over $1 million to convert a concrete barge into a floating ice cream factory, capable of producing 1,500 gallons of ice cream every 10 hours. These vessels were stationed across the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. When Italian sailors or coastal observers saw these ships, they were fundamentally broken by the realization of American surplus. To the Axis, logistics was a desperate struggle for survival. To the Americans, logistics was about ensuring a soldier could have a cold bowl of vanilla in 100-degree heat. This wasn't just luxury. It was a display of overmatch that made the Axis effort look medieval by comparison. From the leadership angle, this was a deliberate strategy. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton understood that morale was a force multiplier. They didn't just want their men fed. They wanted them reminded of the American way of life. This philosophy extended to the treatment of enemy combatants, the moral angle. Instead of the forced labor or starvation common in Soviet or German camps, American POW camps for Italians often resembled small, functional towns. The Americans realized that a well-fed prisoner is a compliant prisoner. This led to the sociological shock of the cigarette economy. American GIs were famously generous, often tossing Lucky Strikes or chocolate bars to captured Italians. To the Italian soldier, the cigarette was more than tobacco. It was a currency of freedom. The smell of American tobacco, rich, distinct, and plentiful, became the scent of the occupation. It signaled a shift in the world order. The old world of European empires and fascist scarcity was being replaced by a new world of consumers' abundance. The Italians didn't just surrender to a military. They surrendered to an economy. They began to realize that the shocking luxury they were witnessing was not a temporary wartime fluke, but a glimpse into a future they wanted to be a part of. The war, for many Italians, ended the moment they realized Americans had more of everything, including kindness. The turning point of the Mediterranean War wasn't just a single explosion. It was a total disintegration of the Axis supply line during Operation Husky in July 1943. As 160,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Sicily, the Italian coastal defense units, men who'd been told that the Americans would be repelled by the iron wall of the Axis, witnessed a spectacle that defied their understanding of reality. They didn't just see a few ships. They saw a horizon filled with over 2,500 vessels. For the Italian commanders in the hills overlooking Gela and Syracuse, the climax of the battle occurred not when the first shells hit, but when they looked through their binoculars at the American beachheads. Expecting to see troops pinned down and starving, they instead saw DUKW amphibious trucks driving straight out of the water and onto the sand, unloading mountains of wooden crates marked Spam, Coke, and Lucky Strike. The Italians, who were rationing their last few rounds of ammunition and eating maggot-infested bread, watched as American GIs sat on their helmets, laughing and eating hot meals from mobile field kitchens just hours after the first wave of the invasion. The industrial shock was instantaneous. In the sectors held by the Italian Livorno and Napoli divisions, the will to resist evaporated as the logistical disparity became visible to the naked eye. At the Battle of Gela, when U.S. Rangers captured the first large groups of Italian prisoners, the climax was psychological. The prisoners weren't just surrendering. They were staring in a trance-like state at the Americans' gear. They touched the waterproof fabric of the American uniforms and marveled at the M1 Garand rifles. One captured Italian officer famously wept not for his country, but because he saw a private soldier eating a Hershey's chocolate bar. He realized that the starving Americans his superiors had described were actually better equipped than the elite of the Italian aristocracy. This was the moment the new Roman Empire died, not under a hail of bullets, but under the sheer, crushing weight of American industrial superiority. The true climax of the Italian prisoners' journey occurred when they left the battlefield entirely. By late 1943, the United States decided to transport hundreds of thousands of Italian POWs back to the American mainland to solve a critical labor shortage in the agricultural sector. For the soldiers who boarded the massive transport ships, the experience was a descent into a world they believed was a fantasy. As the ships approached New York Harbor or the ports of Virginia, the shock of light occurred. Since 1940, Europe and North Africa had been draped in a blackout, a world of darkness to hide from bombers. But as the Italian prisoners stood on the decks, they saw the American coastline ablaze with millions of electric lights. To them, it looked like a city of diamonds. It was a visual proof that the war had never even touched the American heartland. They realized that while they had been fighting for a few meters of sand in Libya, the Americans had been building a civilization of neon and steel. Upon landing, the final logistical climax took place at the processing centers. The prisoners were marched into mess halls that smelled of roasted meat and fresh coffee, scents many had not encountered in years. The Italian privates, accustomed to the rigid and often abusive class structure of their own army, were horrified and then stunned to see American officers and enlisted men eating the same food in the same general areas. Then came the shower shock. Many Italian units had spent months without a proper bath, plagued by lice and skin infections. In the American camps, they were introduced to limitless hot water and industrial quantities of soap. They were given clean, new uniforms, often surplus U.S. Army gear with POW stenciled on the back. To a man who had been wearing the same rotting wool tunic for 2 years, the feel of clean cotton was a revelation. It was at this moment, sitting in a heated barack with a full stomach and a pack of fresh cigarettes, that the average Italian soldier made a silent, definitive choice. They realized that the American enemy was providing a life that their fascist ally could never have promised. The war was no longer about territory. It was about the undeniable victory of the American way of life over the Axis cult of sacrifice. The transition from the front lines to the American interior created a phenomenon historians now call the Golden Captivity. By 1944, over 50,000 Italian POWs were scattered across 27 different states, from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the canning factories of California. What followed was a logistical and sociological anomaly. The prisoners began to thrive. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. was required to feed prisoners the same rations as its own troops. For the Italians, this meant a daily intake of nearly 4,000 calories, double what they received in Mussolini's army. The shock of abundance didn't stop at the mess hall. Because of the labor shortage, the U.S. government allowed Italian prisoners to work for pay, earning about 80 cents a day in scrip canteen coupons. With this, they could buy luxuries that were non-existent in war-torn Europe: Coca-Cola, beer, silk stockings to send home, and even musical instruments. In camps like Camp Letterman in Pennsylvania, Italian prisoners formed orchestras and theater troupes using American-supplied equipment. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound. The American kindness strategy had effectively turned an enemy force into a grateful labor pool. These men, who were supposed to be conquerors of the Mediterranean, were now writing letters home to Italy describing a land where starving Americans had so much grain they kept it in towers, silos, and where even the poorest farmer drove a motorized vehicle. The aftermath of their capture was not a period of suffering, but a period of re-education through prosperity. They began to realize that the decadent American lifestyle they were told to hate was actually a level of human dignity they had never been allowed to imagine. This realization spread through their letters home like a slow-burning fire, undermining the morale of the families left behind in Italy who were still living under German occupation and fascist austerity. As the war neared its end in 1945, the ice cream and abundance strategy yielded a geopolitical dividend that no bomb could have achieved. The hundreds of thousands of Italian POWs returning from the United States were no longer the same men who had surrendered in the sands of Tunisia or the hills of Sicily. They were transformed. They didn't return with stories of American cruelty. They returned as ambassadors of the American dream. They spoke of the land of plenty, where even a prisoner of war was treated with more dignity than a loyal soldier in the Regio Esercito. The logistical aftermath manifested in the massive shift in Italian public opinion. When the post-war elections arrived in 1946 and 1948, Italy stood at a crossroads between the communist East and the capitalist West. The memory of the American bounty, the white bread, the chocolate, the endless supply of medicine, and yes, the ice cream, played a decisive role. The returning prisoners knew that the Soviet promise of a workers' paradise couldn't compete with the reality of the American factory they had seen with their own eyes. They had seen the industrial might that could build a floating ice cream parlor while simultaneously launching 100 ships a month. Furthermore, the American occupation of Italy itself became a Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan. The sheer volume of surplus equipment left behind, jeeps that were converted into tractors, parachutes that were sewn into wedding dresses, and ration tins that became household storage, integrated American industrialism into the DNA of a new Italian republic. The shock of the luxury they witnessed as prisoners became the blueprint for Italy's own economic miracle in the 1950s. The war ended not just with a treaty, but with a total cultural pivot. The Italian people didn't just accept the American presence. They pursued the American lifestyle. Fueled by the memory of the shocking generosity and unstoppable resources they encountered when they thought all was lost. The story of the Italian POWs and the American ice cream barges is often told as a lighthearted footnote to the carnage of World War II, but its historical significance is far more profound. It represents a paradigm shift in the nature of human conflict. For millennia, war was defined by the struggle for scarcity, capturing land for grain, seizing wells for water, and starving an enemy into submission. The United States, however, introduced a new and terrifying variable: the strategic use of abundance. The shock felt by the Italian soldiers wasn't just a reaction to a sweet dessert or soft bread. It was a sudden, crushing realization that they were fighting an opponent that had moved beyond the basic struggle for survival. When a nation can afford to dedicate $1 million to a floating ice cream factory in the middle of a global apocalypse, it isn't just winning a war. It is demonstrating that the war has already been won on the factory floor and in the wheat fields of the Midwest. This was the gentle dominance. By feeding the hungry and providing luxury to the defeated, the United States didn't just break the Italian army. It won the hearts of the Italian people for generations to come. As we look back at the scorched landscapes of the 1940s, we see that the most enduring American weapon wasn't the tank or the bomber, but the logistics of kindness and the culture of plenty. The Italian prisoners who looked at the lights of New York or tasted their first Hershey's bar were the first witnesses to a new world order. One where the measure of superpower was not just how many men it could kill, but how many it could feed, clothe, and ultimately inspire. The ice cream barge remains the ultimate symbol of that era, a bizarre, magnificent, and unstoppable monument to the idea that a civilization is at its most powerful when it has enough to share, even with its enemies.